addition, I'd like to make a statement on the Omicron variant and the steps that we're taking to keep our country safe. We've always known that a worrying new variant could be a threat to the progress that we've made as a nation. We're entering the winter in a strong position, thanks to the decisions we made in the summer and the defences that we have built. Our vaccination programme has been moving at a blistering pace, and this weekend we reached the milestone of 17 million boosters across the UK. This means that even though cases have been rising, hospital admissions have fallen a further 11% in the past week, and deaths have fallen by 17%. But just as the vaccination programme has shifted the odds in our favour, a worrying new variant has always had the opportunity to shift them back. Last week, I was alerted to what is now known as the Omicron variant, now designated a variant of concern by the World Health Organization. We're learning more about this new variant all the time, but the latest indication is that it spreads very rapidly. It may impact the effectiveness of one of our major treatments for COVID-19, Ronapreve. And, as the Chief Medical Officer said this weekend, there's a reasonable chance that our current vaccines may be impacted. I can update the House that there have now been 5 confirmed cases in England and also 6 confirmed cases in Scotland, and we expect cases to rise over the coming days. The new variant has also been spreading across the world. Confirmed cases have been reported in many countries, including Austria, Belgium, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Portugal. In this race between the vaccines and the virus, the new variant may have given the virus extra legs. So our strategy is to buy ourselves time and to strengthen our defences while our world-leading scientists learn more about this potential threat. On Friday, I updated the House about the measures we've put in place, including how, within hours, we'd placed 6 countries in southern Africa on the travel red list. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to update the House on more balanced and proportionate steps that we are taking. First, measures at the border to slow the incursion of the variant from abroad. On Saturday, in line with the updated advice from the UK Health Security Agency, we acted quickly to add 4 other countries to the travel red list: Angola, Mozambique, Malawi and Zambia. This means that anyone who's not a UK or Irish national or resident who's been in any of these countries over the previous 10 days will be refused entry. And those who are allowed entry must isolate in a government-approved facility for 10 days. Beyond this red list, we're also going further to put in place a proportionate testing regime for arrivals from across the world. So we'll require anyone who enters the UK to take a PCR test by the end of their 2nd day after they arrive, and to self-isolate until they receive a negative result. The regulations for this have been laid before the House today and will come into effect at 4 a.m. tomorrow. Second, we've announced measures to slow the spread of the virus here in the UK. We're making changes to our rules on self-isolation for close contacts in England to reflect the greater threat that may be posed by this new variant. So close contacts of anyone who tests positive with a suspected case of Omicron must self-isolate for 10 days, regardless of whether they have been vaccinated or not. Face coverings will also be made compulsory in shops and on public transport in England unless an individual has a medical exemption. The regulations for self-isolation and face coverings have been laid before the House today and will come into force at 4 a.m. tomorrow. But I can confirm to the House that there will be a debate and votes on these 2 measures to give the House the opportunity to have its say and to perform valuable scrutiny. My right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, will be setting out more details shortly and will be reviewing all of these measures that I've set out today after 3 weeks to see whether they are still necessary. Third, Mr. Speaker, we're strengthening the defences we've built against the virus. We're already in a stronger position than we were when we faced the Delta variant. We have a much greater capacity for testing, an enhanced ability for sequencing, and the collective protection that's offered by 114 million jabs in arms. And so I would like to update the House on our vaccination programme as well. Our COVID-19 vaccination programme has been a national success story. We've delivered more booster doses than anywhere else in Europe, and we've given top-up jabs to over 1 in 3 people over the age of 18 across the United Kingdom. I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the NHS, the volunteers, the armed forces, and everyone else that has been involved in this life-saving work. Our vaccines remain our best line of defence against this virus, in whatever form it attacks us. There's a lot we don't know about how our vaccine responds to this new variant. But although it's possible that they may be less effective, it's highly unlikely they will have no effectiveness at all against serious disease. So it's really important that we get as many jabs in arms as possible. Over the next few weeks, we were already planning to do 6 million booster jabs in England alone. But against this backdrop of this new variant, we want to go further and faster. So I asked the JCVI, the government's independent expert advisors on vaccinations, to urgently review how we could expand the programme and whether we should reduce the gap between second doses and boosters. The JCVI published its advice in the last hour. First, it advised that the minimum dose interval for booster jabs should be halved from 6 months to 3 months. Second, that the booster programme should be expanded to include all remaining adults aged 18 and above. Third, that these boosters should be offered by age group in a descending order to protect those who are most vulnerable to the virus. So priority will be given to older adults and people over 16 who are at risk. Fourth, that severely immunosuppressed people aged 16 or above who've received 3 primary doses should now also be offered a booster dose. Finally, that children aged between 12 and 15 should be given a second dose 12 weeks from the first dose. I have accepted this advice in full. With this new variant on the offensive, these measures will protect more people more quickly and make us better protected as a nation. It represents a huge step up for our vaccination programme, almost doubling the number of people who will be able to get a booster dose to protect themselves and their loved ones. And I know that we are asking more from NHS colleagues who've already given us so much throughout this crisis, but I know that they will be up to the task. The NHS will be calling people forward at the appropriate time so that those who are most vulnerable will be prioritised. And I'll be setting out more details of how we are putting this advice into action in the coming days. Mr. Speaker, our fight against this virus is a global effort, and so I'd like to update the House on the part that the UK is playing. We currently hold the presidency of the G7. And earlier today, I convened an urgent meeting of G7 health ministers to coordinate the international response. We were unanimous in our praise for the leadership shown by South Africa, who was so open and transparent about this new variant. And we were resolute in our commitment to working closely with each other, the World Health Organization, and, of course, the wider international community to tackle this common threat. Mr. Speaker, our experience of fighting this virus has shown us that it's best to act decisively and swiftly when we see a potential threat, which is why we're building our defences and putting these measures in place without delay. Scientists are working at speed, at home and abroad, to determine whether this variant is more dangerous, and I can assure the House that if it emerges that this variant is no more dangerous than the Delta variant, then we won't keep measures in place for a day longer than necessary. COVID-19 is not going away, and so we'll have to keep seeing new variants emerge. So if we want to live with the virus for the long term, we must follow the evidence and act in a proportionate and responsible way if a variant has the potential to thwart our progress. And as we do this, We are taking a well-rounded view, looking not just at the impact of these measures of the virus, but the impact to the economy, to education, and non-COVID health, such as mental health. And I'm confident that these responses that we set out today are balanced and responsible steps that are proportionate to the threat that we face. Mr. Speaker, this year, our nation has come so far down our road of recovery, but we always knew that there would be bumps in the road. But this is not a time to waver. It's a time to be vigilant and to think about what each and every one of us can do to slow the spread of this new variant. Getting a jab when the time comes, following the rules that we've put in place, and getting rapid, regular tests. If we all come together once again, then we can keep this virus at bay and protect the progress that we have made. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Dr. Rosena Hallen-Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by sending my best wishes to the Shadow Secretary of State, who cannot be here as he is currently off with COVID, and we all hope he gets better soon. I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. This variant is a wake-up call. The pandemic is not over. We need to act with speed to bolster our defences to keep the virus at bay. And it is also an important reminder that no one is safe until all of us are safe. Ministers have not met the commitments that were made this summer at the G7 to get the vaccine rolled out to other parts of the globe. What update can the Secretary of State give on the government's global commitments? And given that Omicron is already here, what we do at home truly matters. There are measures that we can put in place right now to keep infections down and ensure the country has the best possible protection. Can he set out the rationale for not introducing pre-departure testing? Surely this would be an effective way of preventing people travelling with COVID into our country. We support the decision to introduce masks on public transport and in shops, but we believe this should never have been abandoned in the first place. Keeping masks in place would always have been our plan A. Will the Secretary of State extend the use of masks to hospitality and other settings? Or does COVID not spread in pubs? Most importantly, what is the plan to enforce mask wearing? Shop workers have given so much during the last 20 months alongside our emergency services. Asking shop workers to enforce mask wearing is yet another pressure that they do not need and do not deserve. If masks had been mandatory, it would have been harder for this new variant to spread. A global study published in the British Medical Journal argued that face mask wearing can bring transmission down as much as 53%. And this government's flip-flopping on masks has created confusion across schools, colleges and universities. So can the Secretary of State today confirm the new requirements across all education settings? And the Prime Minister is not the best person to tell people to wear masks when he can't even be bothered to wear one himself when he goes into a hospital full of vulnerable patients. And can I ask the Secretary of State when Conservative backbenchers will start wearing their masks? Can the Secretary of State update the House on when he expects there to be a decision on vaccinations for younger children? As the government has fallen far short of its own target to offer all 12 to 15-year-olds the vaccine by October half-term, so can he say what action will be taken to speed up vaccine rollout? Our NHS have done us proud and have done a fantastic job to deliver the vaccine, offering first, second, third and booster jabs all at the same time as treating patients suffering from COVID and trying to recover elective procedures. I'd like to take this time to thank everyone who works in our NHS and care sector, and we're putting even more demands on them at the moment. Our NHS has stepped up to the challenge, and it is a shame that this government simply hasn't done that. Vaccine rates among those with mental illnesses are low and mortality rates high. The government needs to stop weaponising mental health and instead must recognise that good, clear, honest communication is so important in a crisis, something that they have failed to do so far. And I know, and I've mentioned time and time again, but the government must acknowledge the trauma for people with severe COVID, long COVID and NHS staff. So where is their plan? Labour has been clear throughout this pandemic that proper sick pay will help people to isolate. The government has chosen to ignore us time and time again, so I ask again, what support will be available to people who need to self-isolate? And isn't this the time to finally fix sick pay? I would also appreciate it if the Secretary of State could update the House on the new antivirals and how they will be utilised. And why are the government not already giving antibody tests to the immunocompromised? The situation we find ourselves in now was entirely predictable. Yet again, this government have shown they are incapable of protecting our communities, protecting our NHS and saving lives.
So stay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, can I also extend my best wishes to the Shadow Health Secretary and wish him a speedy recovery. I do have to say, Mr. Speaker, I do think the Honourable Lady has misjudged the tone of the House. This is a very serious matter, and I think the whole country would be looking for all members of this House to work together and to support the nation. And surely she isn't blaming the UK government for the emergence of this new variant. I feel, Mr. Speaker, perhaps she was just auditioning for the reshuffle that's going on in her party right now. But let me, Mr. Speaker, answer the questions around. She asked about international donations. And the UK is leading the world in international donations, quite rightly so. It is absolutely right that that is treated as a priority. We would like to see other countries step up as well. The Prime Minister made a pledge a few months back of 100 million donations by June 2022, 80% of those through COVAX, of which we are a huge supporter, and 20% bilaterally. And so far we have donated over 20 million, more than almost many other countries. And COVAX, as I said, an organisation we help found and we support, has donated, I believe, some 537 million doses to 144 different countries. The rules, the Honourable Lady asked about the rules on travel and masks and others that I set out. Well, I will say, Mr. Speaker, I think I've addressed that. I do believe that they are proportionate and it's a balanced response. On the vaccine rollout, we've just set out a huge expansion of the vaccine rollout programme. It's a shame that the Honourable Lady could not find it in herself to welcome that vaccine rollout. And as I said, I will set out more details in coming days on exactly how we intend to meet the requirement to vaccinate more. And then on antivirals, we're one of the few countries in the world that have procured the two leading antivirals. We were our regulator, the MHRA, our independent regulator, was the first in the world to approve one of those antivirals. I'm pleased with the over 700,000 courses that we have for citizens across the United Kingdom, but of course, given the emergence of this new variant, we'll be reviewing that and seeing if more needs to be done.
Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The late Donald Rumsfeld coined the phrase known unknowns, and that is what we face with the new Omicron virus. So the Secretary of State is absolutely right to take sensible and proportionate measures to buy time while we are waiting to understand how dangerous this new variant can be. But does he not agree that the fact that we are facing this danger is also a symptom of the failure of Western countries to make sure that vaccines are distributed adequately around the world? And whilst I recognise the enormous contribution the UK has made through COVAX, through the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine and so on, is it not a moral and practical failure that richer countries have managed to vaccinate 60% of their populations, when for poorer countries it's just 3%?
So stay.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for his support? And I do agree with his words. It is important that all rich countries do everything they can to support vaccines and donations of vaccines to developing countries. I've set out earlier what the UK has done, and we can be proud of that, but we do need other countries to set up. In the G7 meeting I chaired earlier today with health ministers, we all agreed of the importance of this and about redoubling efforts to make sure all commitments are met.
SNP spokesperson Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, and also add my own thanks to the work that the NHS does and continues to do in all parts of these islands to keep us all healthy and safe. The emergence of Omicron, including the 6 cases that we've seen in Scotland, along with the evidence of community transmission, shows that this is absolutely no time to be complacent. But for all the measures that are being taken now at the border, day 2 PCR testing, because of the incubation period, risks missing a number of these cases passing through the border. And a more effective approach, surely, would be to introduce day 8 PCR testing along with 8 days of isolation to accompany it. And it would surely be better to do that now than to be bounced into that position by events further down the line. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State issues a call for us all to work together, which I'm sure we would all wish to be able to do. But I wonder if he shares my disappointment that when the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales today called for a COBRA meeting to be convened, it appeared to be dismissed out of hand already. So I wonder, will the Secretary of State prevail upon the Prime Minister to call, attend and convene an urgent COBRA meeting involving all 4 nations, so that people might be persuaded that he's on top of this development, as we would all expect him to be? And finally, I wonder, would the Secretary of State agree with the opposition front bench and the Chair of the Select Committee and myself that this emergence of this variant shows that none of us are safe until all of us are safe, and that however much is being done and however much the UK has done to date, more still needs to be done in order to achieve as close to 100% global vaccination as is possible. That not only includes the vaccination programmes that we're in, but it involves increasing global vaccine production as well as overcoming the barriers that patent law might place in the way of achieving that.
Mr. Speaker, can I first turn to the honourable gentleman's question around the day 2 testing? We do believe that the day 2 testing requirement is the proportionate response for international travel. He will know that it applies to all incoming arrivals into the UK, and that the individual concerned would have to self-isolate until they get a negative test result. And I think that is the right response. In terms of meetings and UK nations working together, I think that has been one of the successes of the UK response to this pandemic, the way that the nations across the UK have worked together, especially on vaccines, on testing, on surveillance and antivirals, and it shows that we're stronger together.
Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Sir Andrew Pollard, who developed the Oxford vaccine, predicted to my Select Committee in June that new variants would escape the vaccines by being more infectious, but that protection against severe illness should continue. Yes. So will my right honourable friend avoid taking any panic measures if we see a rise in infections during the weeks ahead, as seems inevitable, and concentrate instead on the vaccine's effectiveness against severe illness and hospitalisation?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. We have already, as I referred to in my statement, even with the dominant Delta variant at the moment, we have seen some rises in infections, but we've been seeing falls in hospitalisation, in death rates, thankfully too. And the reason for that is the power of the vaccines, especially our booster program, the largest in Europe. So my right honourable friend is absolutely right that what matters as we look ahead around this new variant is what matters more than anything is hospitalisations.
Clyburn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The second line in the Secretary of State's statement says, "We've always known that a worrying new variant could be a threat to the progress we've made as a nation." With that in mind, does he think it was wrong for the government to abandon mask wearing in public places and confined spaces? And will he listen to the recommendations of Doreen Lawrence's report and start to issue full face protection masks to care workers and health workers?
So state.
Mr. Speaker, surely the honourable gentleman isn't suggesting that if we had different rules on masks over the summer, that this new variant would not have emerged.
Andrea Lenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure my right honourable friend will want to pay tribute to the South African government for raising the existence of the Omicron variant, and obviously that has resulted in them having a travel ban imposed. I do have constituents and in fact family members stuck in South Africa. So can my right honourable friend tell us how long he expects cancellations and suspensions of flights to occur? Because obviously for anyone stuck overseas, it's a very worrying time.
State.
First of all, I join my right honourable friend in again expressing thanks to the South African government about how they have handled this difficult situation. And I also understand what my right honourable friend has said about her constituents. Many of us will have constituents in a similar position. And it is hard to say when direct flights might start, but we have started our hotel booking programme, so that is one part of trying to get our citizens back, but we will do everything we can to support them in that way.
Well, Rivals.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State, quite rightly, we praised the South African doctor, but she saw her patient face to face. Could I ask the Secretary of State what advice, guidance or instruction he's going to give to the GPs? I know my constituents in Walsall South are keen to see their GPs face to face, but this may be more effective than test and trace.
Tuesday.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady is an important question, and one thing we are doing at this point is updating guidance throughout the NHS, including primary care.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Speaker. In his statement, the Secretary of State said that the legislation that he's laid before the House, which incidentally isn't yet available on the legislation.gov website for members to study, he said close contacts of anyone who tests positive with a suspected case of Omicron must self-isolate for 10 days regardless of whether they've been vaccinated. Can I just confirm with him, first of all, that is what is in the regulations, and secondly, for the benefit of the House, could he set out what he set out yesterday in the television studios, the mechanism by which the Omicron variant will be identified and communicated to those people contacted by test and trace, so that we all know how this is going to work, as it's more complicated than the system we've had to date.
Secretary of State.
Yeah, what I can tell my right honourable friend is that what I can confirm is that the new regulation on close contact will be anyone that is a close contact of someone that is a confirmed positive case of suspected Omicron. The UKHSA is working at speed about what are the best ways to determine a suspected case. One of the ways to do that is to do the so-called S-gene dropout test, but there are other quick ways to ascertain that as well. And the work in terms of tracing will be carried out by UK Test and Trace.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's often said that how a society treats its most vulnerable is a measure of its humanity. And yet a quarter of the clinically extremely vulnerable are yet to have their third primary dose because of the confusion that persists between the third primary dose and the booster. 1 in 5 of the clinically extremely vulnerable are still shielding without any government guidance or support. For them, the uncertainty of the new variant is quite frankly terrifying. So will the Secretary of State or one of his ministers please agree to meet with me and patient groups to discuss our 5-point plan on how we can protect the clinically extremely vulnerable this winter?
Secretary of State.
The vaccines minister is meeting with patient groups this week, but she would also be happy to meet with the honourable lady.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I join others in welcoming the well-judged and rapid action this weekend, and also welcome the acceleration of boosters, including the new provision of a mass vaccination this weekend in Newmarket. And while existing vaccinations, including boosters, are effective against all known major variants before Omicron, can he set out plans for a variant vaccine should it be needed in the worst-case scenario?
So state.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his support? When it comes to potentially new vaccines, that is a programme that the UK has been supporting, largely thanks to his efforts when he was in my position. And that work continues. And if it is necessary to procure new vaccines that we believe are safe and effective and will help with this new variant, we will do so.
Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gordon Brown said yesterday that the Chief Medical Officer urgently needs to teach the Prime Minister some basic medical facts. I'd say that could probably be extended to some of those on the backbenches opposite as well. Meaning, we're not going to stop the threat of variants.
Sorry. Mr Shelbrooke, I thought you might be going on the NATO delegation, and I don't want to that you've missed out on it. Please carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to stop the threat of variants derailing our progress until we vaccinate the world. Our country has enough vaccine to give at least 3 doses to everybody. Yet, of the 100 million doses that were pledged by the Prime Minister to the world's poorest, less than 10% have actually been delivered. So, can the Secretary of State tell us if the PM will meet his ambition to help vaccinate the world by the end of 2021, or is this yet another broken promise with catastrophic consequences?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I think I did say earlier, out of the 100 million commitment the UK has made for international donations, over 20 million have already gone, been delivered, and there's another 10 million about to go.
You're married.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The return of PCR testing will be met with some apprehension by the international travel sector, which has just been getting back onto its feet. But they will at least be cheered by the Secretary of State's statement that we won't keep measures in place for a day longer than is necessary. Can I ask the Secretary of State to ensure that the providers of PCR tests are those that will actually give accurate, good value testing back to the public, and we will not see some of the issues that arose over the summer repeat themselves?
So state.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very important point. I know he rightly takes a close interest in this, and we do want to minimise any impact on our excellent transport and travel sector. And he's right to raise the importance of making sure that PCR tests are available, the pricing is correct, and that the government website where they're listed is properly monitored, so if anyone who breaks the rules is delisted.
Barbara Keeler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although the measures taken so far are welcome, now that we have community transmission of Omicron in Brentwood and in Scotland, we need more protective interventions. Mask wearing can obviously play an important part, so can the Secretary of State say whether he agrees with the call from the BMA to extend this to all indoor and closed settings? And will he also consider measures to increase ventilation in enclosed settings, encourage working from home, and give proper sick pay for those who need to isolate?
So state.
I think, Mr. Speaker, we've been clear about why we have set out the new rules on masks. I think our response is the proportionate one. When it comes to ventilation, the Honourable Lady is right to raise the importance of that. That's why it's very clear in guidelines, and many places are following that. And when it comes to sick pay, it's right that we've kept rules in place that allow people, should they be tested positive or have to self-isolate, that they can claim sick pay from day one.
Teresa Villiers.
If the situation deteriorates, and we all hope it won't, but if it does, please can the government do everything possible not to shut down the hospitality and events sector again? Millions of people have their livelihoods depend on this. They're just getting back on their feet. Please let us not knock them down again.
So stay.
Mr. Speaker, I agree absolutely with my right honourable friend.
Neil Hamby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The emergence of Omicron is not really much of a surprise. It's more a case of when, not if. And anecdotal evidence from South Africa suggests that whilst it may be more infectious, the potency does seem to be more limited. The particular concern is the mutations to the spike protein in 2 specific areas, and I just wonder what action the government are taking to put additional resources into adjuvant therapy development, particularly given the impact on monoclonal antibody therapies and the vaccine, and what is the status of genomic surveillance in the UK at present?
Stay.
Mr. Speaker, first I think it's fair to say that our genomic surveillance has never been so strong. And it was getting stronger even before the pandemic, but because of the pandemic, there's been a huge amount of investment and it's paid off UK-wide. In terms of the treatments, there is some concern around this new variant and Ronapreve, which is one of the key monoclonal antibodies that we use for treatment, but it is just concern at this point. There's no particular evidence. But part of the reason for taking these measures is to buy the time that we need, the 2 weeks or so, 2-3 weeks to give our scientists time to assess the risk of this variant properly.
Mr. Graham-Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has the Secretary of State made of those early reports from South Africa that the variant may actually lead to less severe illness than the previous variants? And secondly, can I welcome the fact we have both a debate and a vote tomorrow on these regulations, but wouldn't it be better if we had the debate and the vote before the restrictions come into force rather than after?
You would think.
Can I tell Mr. Speaker, in response to my right honourable friend, in terms of the debate and the vote tomorrow, I believe the leader will be making a statement on that shortly, I think right after my statement. In terms of the severity, there are reports, as my right honourable friend has referred to, that it is early days in terms of those reports, and we are looking into those and talking actually with our South African friends and getting more details. I think it is worth pointing out that the age profile, the demographics in South Africa is generally people on average are younger, and we are taking that into account as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State set out in his statement this afternoon about the booster programme for the vaccines, but he hasn't mentioned what steps he is going to be taking to support those areas where take-up of the vaccine is still very low. So can he now set out what additional resources will be provided to those areas where we know that the take-up of the vaccine is still very low?
It's an important point, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady is right to raise it. There are still, we estimate, around 5 million people across the UK that have not even taken up the offer of their first dose of the vaccine, putting themselves and their loved ones at great risk. In terms of action, there's a lot of work that's been done over the last few months. It is bearing result. We are seeing more and more people come forward, especially in the last few weeks, and indeed we saw many come forward this weekend, perhaps out of concern of this new variant. But there's a lot of work being done with community leaders. There's been an existing communications campaign, but there's a new one about to start imminently.
So Desmond Sway.
Over the last few months, there's been a useful control experiment on face coverings, given the different policies pursued in Scotland and England. What estimate has he made of the result? It's mumbo-jumbo, isn't it?
So State.
I think if my right honourable friend is suggesting that there are mixed views on the efficacy of face coverings in helping to fight this pandemic, he would be right. But I would point him to work that's already been set out by UKHSA. I think it was published, if I remember correctly, last month, where they refer to a number of reports where they set out in certain settings how face coverings could help.
Catherine West.
Speaker, what urgent action is being taken to vaccinate people who are bedbound?
So State.
For Mr. Speaker, for such individuals, they're bedbound, homebound, or vulnerable for other reasons and can't make it to vaccination centres, those vaccinations are primarily carried out by GPs. I don't have the numbers of how many have actually been done, but recently, to encourage more people to be done more quickly, we did change the payment system for GPs, and that seems to have helped as well.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The opposition often call for more restrictions, but it was the relaxation of restrictions in the summer that this government took under scientific advice that has put Britain in a good position prior to the arrival of this variant. So while I welcome the statement and the precautionary and proportionate measures he's taken today, will the Secretary of State assure me and the House that this is a temporary measure, and when we get more information, when we've bought more time, we will get new measures to react to that information?
So State.
Yes, I'm very happy to give that assurance to my honourable friend, he's absolutely right, and this is all about buying a bit of time so our scientists get the time that they need to properly assess this variant and determine what it really is. Should we really be worried about it or not? But he's also right, Mr. Speaker, to point out that we did take measures in the summer where we set out that we were removing almost all domestic rules and controls. They turned out to be absolutely the right measures. There's many of my counterparts in Europe that now they believe that they should have taken a similar route as well. But I do remember they were all opposed by the party opposite.
Vicky Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Immunocompromised people continue to be worried. Many still don't know if the vaccine works on them. The Octave study showed that around 150,000 people potentially have reduced or no antibody response. Octave Duo is not due to report until early next year. Will the Secretary of State ensure this population have access to antibody tests, thus allowing them to know their level of protection? And for those with little or no protection, will he ensure that they have the support they need to stay safe?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. We want to make sure that we are helping people that are immunosuppressed in every way that is possible, including access to any tests that might be clinically required. The Honourable Lady may have noted earlier in the JCVI advice that I referred to that there's also a recommendation which we have accepted to say that those that are immunosuppressed that are able to benefit from vaccine to some extent, that they are offered a booster dose on top of the third primary dose, and then also the antivirals are very important for that particular group of vulnerable people, and it's good that the UK has procured them.
Bob Seeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State, on behalf of Government, reassure me that the Foreign Office and the consular service in the Foreign Office will be doing all that it can, because I'm already receiving calls from islanders stuck in Southern Africa who are worried about their ability to get back. Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance. We have been working closely with colleagues in the Foreign Office, and it will remain vital work so we can help people, UK citizens or Irish citizens that might be stuck abroad, to come back.
Interesting. Larry Ben.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Given the change to the rules for booster vaccinations announced by the JCVI this afternoon, how long does the Secretary of State think it will be before all the people who've had their first and second jabs come forward and can receive the booster jab from age 18 to age 40, so as much of the population as possible is protected?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, first, if I could tell the right honourable gentleman that we've already done 17 million, and that is almost one-third of the adult population. It's more than any other country in Europe. But he's right to ask how quickly could we do those that will become newly eligible. If he allows me, I will have to come back to the House and set out details about how we intend to meet this advice. This advice was very quickly received from the JCVI over the weekend. They did stellar work to turn it around so quickly, but I have already asked the NHS about operationalising it, and we're not quite there yet, but we will be very shortly, and I will set that out.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. None of us underplayed the threat of any new variant, and as my right honourable friend said today, COVID is not going to go away. It's not. It's here for the rest of our lives. The country is learning to live with this disease now. It is the only way forward. Can he please reassure me, the House and the country, that he will never, ever go back to locking this country down?
Mr. Speaker, I mean, no one wants to see those kind of measures, but the honourable gentleman, I'm sure, will agree with me that, well, first let me agree with him that COVID is with us to stay, and we need to learn to live with it. And the best way I think we can do that is with the primary form of defence that we've got, which is our vaccination programme. And I hope he agrees with me. We're absolutely right to basically put the booster programme on steroids, because that will really help us.
Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the most COVID vulnerable settings in the country is school classrooms. And children have a much, much lower vaccination rate than adults. And children come from all over communities to one place and then return in the afternoon to families. Now, masks are being returned to corridors, but they're not being returned to classrooms. I take no pleasure in advising the Secretary of State to make children wear masks in classrooms. However, it is absolutely clear what the stakes are going to be if we get this wrong. Students have already been absent from schools by their hundreds of thousands this term, and we are approaching the exam season. If we just act cautiously in the next few days, exams will be able to be sat as normal. If we get this wrong, exams will be wrecked for the third year running, and that will play havoc with their futures, and it will play havoc with teachers and their ability to get the job done on behalf of our country.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will know that the Education Department has set out today fresh guidance on masks in communal areas, not in classrooms. I think that is the right approach that the government has set out. But in terms of protecting children from this pandemic, the vaccination programme of children is important, especially secondary school children, 12 to 15-year-olds. It's I think around over 40% have been vaccinated. It has certainly increased since we opened up the national booking system to that cohort, and I think for 16, 17-year-olds it's almost 60% now, but we continue to work on it.
Andrew Bridgen.
Speaker. My right honourable friend has outlined the government response to the emergence of the Omicron variant and the restrictions that he wishes to place on the public. This House will quite rightly have a vote on these measures. He's also stated that these measures will be reviewed in 3 weeks' time. He knows that in 3 weeks' time this House will be in recess. How will there be parliamentary scrutiny of the government's review measures, or will we be having government by diktat?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the review should take place as soon as possible, and that is how the government determined it's 3 weeks. And unless Parliament was called back from recess, or the government took longer than 3 weeks, there's no way. I think the approach the government has set out is the right one.
Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State says that rich countries must do everything they can to ensure more vaccines reach the global south. Judging by his actions, he means doing everything except the main thing they're actually asking for, which is the waiving of intellectual property rules at the World Trade Organization so that they can manufacture vaccines themselves. This is about justice, not about charity. So will he admit that his government's failure to work with the vast majority of countries in the world, including the United States, who do support a TRIPS waiver at the WTO, is endangering us all? And when will he start putting the need to end this pandemic in front of the financial interests of Big Pharma?
Mr. Speaker, I've heard what the Honourable Lady had to say, but the UK does not believe that waiving patent rights, the intellectual property rights to those that, on these vaccines would be helpful. It would certainly mean that in the future there will be a huge disincentive for vaccine companies, pharmaceutical companies to come forward and help the world with their technology.
Sir Charles Walker.
I say to the Secretary of State, injecting people, not just in this country, but around the world, is a huge logistical undertaking. I believe in India they use nasal vaccines for the administration of the flu vaccine. Please, can the government bring forward nasal vaccines? We did it in 9 months for an injectable vaccine, March 2020 to December 2020. It's now nearly December 21 and still no nasal vaccine, despite in trials high levels of efficacy being proven.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to raise the importance of vaccine delivery mechanisms, and I believe if there was an approved nasal vaccine delivery mechanism, that it would be helpful. But he will understand we do have to allow the regulators the time to assess new delivery mechanisms, but we do take this very seriously.
Debbie Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wholeheartedly agree that no one is safe until we are all safe. And I think the UK and other G7 countries need to take some responsibility for the emergence of this variant. But I just wanted to touch on the fact that we already have community spread of this variant. And if we're going to contain that, we must ensure that contact tracing is relevant and is widespread as possible. So can the Secretary of State, I've asked him this in the last few weeks, confirm that the Containment Outbreak Management Fund will be extended beyond March, and for those places that don't have it, that they will have it. And of course, those that have already spent it will be able to be properly resourced. Thank you.
So the Honourable Lady makes an important point about contact tracing. In terms of the Containment Management Outbreak Fund, especially given the emergence of this variant, we are actively reviewing it.
Steve Bryan.
Very much, sir. I welcome the widening of the booster programme that he's announced, but my constituents still have to have no walk-in access in Winchester, so I'd really appreciate his help with that on behalf of an increasing number of constituents contacting me. Now, the measures that will be asked to approve tomorrow night will likely appear rather small in and of themselves, but he knows the wider impact of the past few days is absolutely huge. You know, we've got nativity plays cancelled or moved online. These are moments that we just don't get back, and community events being cancelled just in case. So the Prime Minister said this lunchtime, if you're boosted, we know your response to this variant is strong. So can I ask my right honourable friend what evidence base this is drawn from, and when we might reasonably expect data from the scientists on how, if at all, the variant hits vaccine efficacy?
First of all, I noted what my honourable friend said, Mr. Speaker, about walk-in access in Hampshire, so I will take that away and get back to him. Secondly, in terms of, he's also right to talk about the impact of these measures. Although, as I said, I believe they are right and proportionate and balanced, we must never forget the impact they have on individuals and their daily lives, and that is why they must be removed the moment it is safe to remove them. And in terms of when we will have more data, the reason we set a 3-week review point is that is the time that we believe that we will have more information, not just the information we come up with ourselves, but through our international counterparts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I thank the Secretary of State and his team for all they do to combat COVID-19 diseases in the UK. It has an effect upon Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Health Minister just yesterday said that they will follow in Northern Ireland the guidance that comes from Westminster. With that in mind, having heard a leading Northern Ireland scientist this week say that he believes the current vaccination and booster rollout will have an effect on the new variant, could the Secretary of State assure us that any and all curtailments, such as those faced by the travel industry currently, will be proportionate and scientific, taking into account transmission and the seriousness of the new COVID vaccine variation? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can give the honourable gentleman that assurance.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As someone who very thankfully received his booster jab last Thursday at the outstanding St Thomas's Hospital, can I ask him why it is that certain groups and communities seem to fear vaccination? Which are these groups and communities, and what can be done to persuade them that they're wrong?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell my right honourable friend that there are many communities where vaccine take-up is lower than others. It has been particularly the case in the Black African community in Britain and also some other black minority ethnic communities. It has improved significantly over the last 2 to 3 months. And it is something that is also the case in many of the European countries and indeed the US. In terms of what's being done is a huge amount of work through community leaders and through a communications campaign, and also by offering access in many different ways as possible to the vaccine to encourage take-up.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. Can the Secretary of State talk a bit more about the transmissibility of the Omicron variant and the efficacy of vaccines to it, given Australia has some of the toughest entry requirements of any country in the world, and yet this variant has basically got through a concrete wall?
It's an important point, Mr. Speaker, by the honourable gentleman, is that I think it's fair to say we don't know enough yet. I don't think Australia does, we do, or any other country for that matter. But we do know enough to justify the action that's been taken. And from that, there is emerging evidence that it is more transmissible, but I don't think we can describe it as conclusive at this point. And in terms of efficacy, I would just point to the point I made earlier to my honourable friend about taking the time to determine the efficacy.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the speedy and decisive action taken by the government over the weekend in response to this new variant. I also welcome the delivery of 17.5 million boosters. And will the Secretary of State join me in thanking not only my pharmacy-led vaccination centres, where I had my first and second doses of AZ, but also my GP-led clinics, where I had my Pfizer booster. And is he confident that that infrastructure is in place and also the robust supply of vaccines as we try and deliver 6 million more booster vaccines over the next 3 weeks?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, when it comes to supply, we're very confident about the supply that we have, including accommodating the new advice that I've accepted from JCVI. And I would join him in thanking the many thousands of GPs across the country that have been crucial to our vaccine programme. Mr. Speaker, can I just take a moment to my honourable friend, the member for Forest Dean, earlier asked me about the regulations and the timing of the laying of the regulations. And I want to clarify that there are regulations for these new measures. They have been made by my honourable friend, the Minister for Public Health and Vaccines, and they are in the process of being registered with the National Archives, and then they will be laid before Parliament, and they should be available to review online at around 5 p.m.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't feel like this pandemic is going to be over anytime soon. I mean, we've only got to Omicron, not to Omega so far. Can I urge the Secretary of State to look at two particular things? The first is the campaign of disinformation, deliberate campaign of disinformation that is going on around the country. Some of these people are dangerous. Their views are certainly dangerous, and I hope that he will work with the Home Secretary to make sure that we check on all of these campaigns around the new Nuremberg laws, that nobody is going to be doing damage to people who are working in the health service. And secondly, can he tackle the problem of profiteering? Because frankly, some of the companies are charging completely disproportionate prices now for PCR tests. There should surely be a fixed price across the whole of the UK.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is a very good point about the danger of disinformation, how it's actually costing lives, not just here in the UK, but across the world. And he will know, for example, we've talked today a lot about South Africa, rightly, but there's a very low vaccine take-up in South Africa, even when they are available, partly due to this disinformation campaign. And I can assure we're working across government with the Home Office, with DCMS and others to counter this kind of disinformation as best as we can. And on PCR tests, I refer him to the remarks I made a moment ago.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my right honourable friend for taking swift and efficient action in relation to the additional protections that are necessary. But as he reviews the wearing of face masks and the additional restrictions is introduced as more data becomes available, will he also consider real-life scenarios? Because as he's heard calls from members opposite about mask wearing and working from home, is he aware that in Wales, mask wearing and working from home has still been in place since the summer, yet infection rates are still much higher?
Yeah, my right honourable friend is right to raise a difference in terms of the approach that Wales has taken in England. I think like him that we have taken the right approach to face masks, but I welcome his support today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend rightly highlights the role that South Africa's excellent testing and analysis system has had in identifying Omicron. It would be perverse if South Africa was treated less favourably as a result of the resources they put into such analyses. So will he go back and look at those countries that are neighbouring red list countries that have much lower testing and analysis levels and see whether travel restrictions might be appropriate for some of those countries in order to keep people in this country safe?
Mr. Speaker, we will keep that under review, but my honourable friend is also right to raise, again, like many members have across the House, the importance of South Africa and how it has handled this in such a professional and exemplary way. And he might reassure him to know that in the G7 meeting I chaired earlier, we all agree unanimously on that and the importance to continue to work and to support with South Africa.
Stephen Kidd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that if the government just sits back and waits to buy development of new vaccines for new variants, then we'll be left at the back of the queue because industry will always go to the highest bidder, such as the EU or the US. Back in April, Clive Dix, the outgoing head of the vaccine task force, sent the government a specific proposal about a new task force to be set up to fast-track the development of new vaccines for new variants. Yesterday, Mr. Dix revealed that the government's completely failed to respond to his proposal. Can the Secretary of State explain why the government's chosen to ignore Mr. Dix's expert advice?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think it would be correct to say the government has ignored the advice that the honourable gentleman has referred to, and also I think it would be incorrect for him to refer to or to say that the government has somehow, when it comes to vaccines, I think he said it's sit back and waits. You know, I just mentioned earlier the huge expansion in the vaccine programme on the back of the advice from the JCVI, and the fact that the UK has the supply already to meet that. The reason that we have that is because we have a fantastic vaccine task force, better than any other country in the world.
Tricia Gibbs.
Mr. Speaker, most countries in Africa missed the World Health Organization target for a mere 10% of their populations to be vaccinated by the end of last month as they struggle to secure supplies of vaccine. As the Secretary of State heard today, no one is safe until everyone is safe. What more will his government do with international partners to ramp up the sharing of vaccines with the developing countries to lessen the risk of further variant emergence? And what support can be given to developing countries to tackle the mistrust among some sectors of these populations towards the vaccine?
So State.
Mr. Speaker, in the G7 call I had today, we all agreed, all members, about the importance of this issue, working with developing countries, with not just providing the vaccine, but I hope the Honourable Lady would agree, looking at what more can be done in actual, once the country has the vaccine, delivering it locally, whether it's local logistics or other delivery mechanisms, and we will be working hard to see what more we can do together.
Robert Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I just ask my right honourable friend, I thank for what he is doing, but given that, as I understand it, that children are very little risk from this new variant, so can I just ask him to confirm that the schools will not be closed any earlier than in the run-up to the Christmas holidays? And if I could just ask him about the mask policy, can he explain, given that masks aren't required for offices, can he explain the scientific evidence in which the decision was made to ask students to wear masks in corridors?
So State.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, first of all, when it comes to the risk to children from COVID in general, it is a lot less, thankfully, than it is to adults. With regard to this specific new variant, we just don't know enough about it yet to talk specifically about potential impact on children. There are no plans that I am aware of that would require us to close schools early. I think that would be very detrimental to the education of children. And in terms of rules around masks, then my right honourable friend will know that the rules that have been set out today by the Department for Education are guidance for schools in communal areas, and it's something in terms of evidence that the Department of Education will be able to provide with more information on.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. If we're to win this fight against the Omicron variant, then it's absolutely essential that people comply with public health guidance. But with the UK statutory sick pay ranking amongst the lowest in Europe, there are far too many people in this country who simply cannot afford to self-isolate. Will the Secretary of State commit to working with colleagues in the Cabinet to raise the rate of sick pay to at least the equivalent of a week's living wage, so that no one is forced to choose between the right thing and heating their homes at Christmas?
So State.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will know that we have kept rules in place that will allow people to claim sick pay from day one. In terms of whether further support is needed, we keep that under review and will provide further support if it was necessary.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for the work he's been doing and the speed with which he's been doing it. However, can he confirm to my constituents that as soon as more is known about this new variant, and if it is deemed to be less of a threat than first thought, as is starting to emerge from the evidence from South Africa and the people who I first identified it, that he will act swiftly to remove restrictions, particularly the one around self-isolation, regardless of vaccine status, particularly in the run-up to Christmas?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wondered if the Secretary of State could tell us his opinion on whether every member of this House in the chamber should be wearing a mask.
State.
Mr. Speaker, all members of this House know what the guidance is, and it's a decision for them.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, like many in this place, I welcome the statement today, and I agree that further measures and restrictions would only be a necessary evil. Could I please ask the Secretary of State to acknowledge the many millions of people and businesses right across the UK who are clawing back their jobs, their livelihoods and their freedoms after a difficult 2 years? And does he agree that these further restrictions should only be an absolute last resort?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do agree with my honourable friend, and we all know from our experience with this pandemic thus far that the restrictions, whilst many of them may well be necessary to fight COVID, they do have other impacts, especially on the economy, the life chances of people, on child's education, social life, and also I'm very much aware of the impact that it's had on non-COVID health outcomes. So I very much agree with what my honourable friend has said.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to welcome the government's plans to extend the vaccination programme. However, with our NHS under severe pressure after 2 very difficult years, what extra resources is the Secretary of State willing to put forward to support our frontline NHS, particularly our GPs, the ambulance services and A&E?
Mr. Speaker, we have provided just this year alone an additional £34 billion of support to the NHS and the social care system. And each of the areas the honourable gentleman just mentioned, whether it's the GPs through the Winter Access Fund, the support to ambulance trusts, I think over £55 million for the winter pressures, all that extra funding is in place and it's making a real difference.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. She's fighting with her mask. Having received my booster vaccination yesterday, I would like to thank Leicestershire and Rutland Vaccination Service, and particularly Rachel and Abby, for their excellent work. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it is vital that constituents take up their vaccinations, including the booster, to help us all through the winter period?
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. The vaccines remain our primary line of defence. I congratulate her on getting her booster shot yesterday, but I absolutely agree with her wholeheartedly that everyone that is eligible should come forward, protect themselves and protect their loved ones.
Rachel Buskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Without in-country manufacturing of the vaccine in the global south, we will never get the protection we need against this pandemic. And supplies, no matter how many donations the government make, will never meet the demand. And therefore, will he again look at the issue about in-country manufacturing, whether that's release of the patent or through other mechanisms, so that we can see a proper scale-up in the global south of the delivery of this vaccine?
I think, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady is right to talk about the importance of in-country manufacturing in the developing world. She will know, for example, that India is one of the largest manufacturers of vaccines, including COVID-19 vaccine, but she rightly points to that growing and being available to other countries, and is right to look to see how we can support that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the acceleration of the booster programme, but can I ask the Secretary of State to do all he can to accelerate the approval by the JCVI of the vaccine for under 12s, particularly the clinically extremely vulnerable? I have a constituent who's 7. He's desperate to go to school without fear. All his parents want is to be able to give him the jab.
State.
My honourable friend is right to raise that. I hope she'll agree with me. The JCVI has acted very quickly since the emergence of this new variant, and if there are other things that can be taken forward to help vaccinate the population, we will certainly be looking at that with great interest.
Steve McKay.
Thank you. I think the Secretary of State briefly mentioned hotel bookings in an answer to a much earlier question, but he'll be aware that over the weekend there were reports of a shortage of quarantine hotel spaces. How's he going to ensure that this doesn't undermine his reasonable attempts at a rapid response to the new variant? And where does someone currently find reliable information about the capacity and availability of such accommodation?
Mr. Speaker, the department already had contingency plans in place if countries were rapidly added to the red list. I believe over 600 rooms were made available on the Sunday morning, and that's rapidly going to increase during the next few days. I think it has already increased since then. And in terms of information, it's available. I believe most of it is available on the government website.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. Clearly the problem here is uncertainty. I welcome the analysis and the 3-week review and the ambition to do it sooner, but following on from the question from my honourable friend, the member from North West Leicestershire, if the review takes place after this House has risen, does he agree with me that we should be recalled to debate its findings?
Mr. Speaker, I think that is a decision we will have to make closer to the time.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the new restrictions being brought in, it is shop workers and workers on transport services who will bear the brunt of asking people to comply. What measures does the government propose to ensure that those workers get the protection that they deserve?
Mr. Speaker, these new rules on face coverings that they will be enforceable by law. The police and other law enforcement authorities will be able to issue penalty notices. I think the penalty starts at £200. I think that should be a last resort, but if necessary, then of course it should be enforced.
Len Saxby.
Mr. Speaker, my North Devon constituents are keen to get boosted with a big queue last night at the Barnstable Leisure Centre vaccination drop-in. But whilst delighted the booster programme is being extended, please can my right honourable friend reassure me that more help will be given to rural constituencies like mine, where residents are struggling to get local appointments despite the hard work of the CCG and vaccination teams?
First, I'm really pleased to hear that her constituents are so keen, and I can also assure her of that support, especially as we now expand the booster programme on the back of the latest JCVI advice.
Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will know very well that the Omicron variation has added alarm to people who are immune compromised, particularly when they're uncertain about the status of whether their third jab was a booster or a specific one for immunocompromised position. There are also people with anomalous positions with respect to the vaccinations. How can, as members of Parliament, we get fast-track information through his department about what is right for individual anomalous constituents?
Well, Mr. Speaker, most people in that situation, they will be contacted either by letter or directly by their GPs. But I do understand the importance of the question, and the honourable gentleman may have heard earlier that one of the pieces of advice from the JCVI that I've accepted is that those that are severely immunocompromised that have received 3 doses as part of their primary course are also now offered a booster dose as well, so a 4th dose, as long as there's been a 3-month gap since their 3rd dose. In many cases, if an individual is unsure, I think the best place for advice is their own GP. If the honourable gentleman would find it helpful to meet with the vaccines minister and get more information, we can set that up as well.
Mr. Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I first of all thank my right honourable friend for his statement today. And could I ask my right honourable friend, he mentioned about reviewing the evidence as quickly as possible, and I ask him, would that include evidence from other countries who have had this variant before it got here. But may I also ask my right honourable friend about flu? Because there's been many health academics who have said that the virulence of flu is growing with the separation that we're doing in wearing masks, etc., and our actual immunity is not tackling flu in the way it used to because we're not mixing. So with the right attention being given to COVID, could I ask my right honourable friend what also is happening looking at other viruses such as the flu, and what plans may be in place if a very virulent strain of that may take on?
Yeah, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend that that in terms of the work that's being done on this variant, it's being done not just in the UK but by our friends across the world. In fact, in the G7 meeting that I had earlier today, we all agreed to cooperate and share whatever information that we get. And he's also right to raise the importance of the flu vaccine. I'm glad he has, to remind the House that whilst we have been talking understandably about the importance of the COVID vaccine and booster vaccines in particular, that the flu vaccine also remains vitally important this winter, and that's one reason why we have the largest flu vaccination programme this country has ever seen.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to hear that there are no plans to close schools, but can I ask what assessment has the government made of the potential for new self-isolation requirements that could keep children out of school, and what steps will be taken to mitigate time out of education, because our children and young people can just not afford to spend any more time away from their educational settings?
Mr. Speaker, we will keep these, of course, these self-isolation requirements, the new requirements, under review. At this point in time, I think very, very few children would be affected because, as she knows, the new requirements only apply to someone who's a close contact who's tested positive with a suspected case of this new variant. But it is something we will keep under review, and the education of children will always be a huge priority.
Now come to a statement from the Leader of the House. We have a business statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should like to make a short business statement following the statement that's just been made by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health. Tomorrow's business will now be a debate to approve the health protection, coronavirus wearing of face coverings, England regulations 2021, and the health protection, coronavirus restrictions, self-isolation, England Amendment number 4, regulations 2021, followed by Opposition Day, 9th allotted day, Part 1. There will be a debate on a motion in the name of the Scottish National Party. The business for the rest of the week remains unchanged to that previously announced, and I shall make a further business statement in the usual way on Thursday.
I now come to the Shadow Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Leader for advance sight of his statement on the change of business, and of course we're pleased that this is happening so quickly. The questions that came up in the discussion around the statement that we've just heard show that there are issues which will need to be debated, and scheduling this debate so promptly means that there will be an opportunity for those questions to be made and discussed. There are also questions about the rules on education, which I think I heard the Secretary of State right. There is going to be a statement from the Secretary of State for Education. If not, I think because there are constituents asking questions of members across the House, and certainly that came up in the briefing, I think, on Saturday, which the Secretary of State kindly gave. If it's possible to know, will there be a further briefing on education? Will that be separate from this? And could I also ask just a very technical thing, how long the Leader is intending to allow for the debate tomorrow, and so that members can sort of be aware of what exactly is the timing that it's likely to happen. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I'm grateful for the kind words of the Shadow Leader. We gave a commitment to debate matters of national importance as soon as possible, and therefore are delivering on that commitment. The debate tomorrow will be 3 hours, and there will be 3 hours of protected time for the debate in the name of the Scottish National Party. My right honourable friend did refer to education in his comments and the importance of education and protecting children, but I will pass on the Honourable Lady's request for more details to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Education.
First of all, can I thank the Leader for setting out, organising a debate for tomorrow, and for it being 3 hours long rather than the 90 minutes required by statute. I think that's welcome. Can I just press him a little, though, on what the Secretary of State said in his statement? He said, and this was a point raised by my honourable friend for North West Leicestershire and my honourable friend for Runnymede and Weybridge. Secretary of State said that the government would be reviewing all the measures that were set out today after 3 weeks. That takes us to Monday the 20th of December, which is in the recess. Now, I hope that the Secretary of State will be able to allow these measures to lapse. But if he is going to feel that he needs to renew them, or worse, have to bring in stronger measures, can I have a commitment from the leader that the House will be recalled to debate and vote on measures ahead of them coming into advance? He will know, over the last couple of weeks, particularly due to the way the government handled the standards measures, there has been a diminution in the trust between backbenchers and ministers, and I think giving a clear commitment to treat Parliament seriously would help heal that rift.
What's that? Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend is, I think, being a little unfair on the government, because he will recall, as he was part of these discussions, as was I and as was the former Secretary of State for Health, in assuring the House that it would get to debate and vote upon important national measures. And bringing forward the debate tomorrow, I think, is a statement of how importantly I personally and others in government take that commitment, that it is only right that this House should approve matters of that kind. There was, of course, a caveat in that agreement, which is that we needed sometimes to act during recesses. Now, actually, mostly that has not, in fact, happened. We've been able to do it when the House has been sitting. But I can't give guarantees as to what will happen in 3 weeks, nor can I give guarantees as to what the desire of the House will be, because it was only Oliver Cromwell who made us sit on Christmas Day.
Owen Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I also thank the Leader for advance sight of his statement. But I'm clearly disappointed that we're losing half of our opposition day, but appreciate the need for bringing forward these pieces of legislation. My question would be why that couldn't have come after we'd had our full opposition day, or given that the government is in charge of the timetabling of business, why they couldn't have found another way that we didn't lose half of our business. So I welcome that we've been given an assurance on protected time, but when will we get the second half of that debate? Will that be Wednesday of this week, perhaps, Madam Deputy Speaker?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I take my responsibility to ensure that oppositions get their opposition days very seriously, and I can give the undertaking that we will try to reschedule the SNP's second half at the earliest opportunity.
John Redwood.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I appreciate prompt debate on the mask wearing and the 3 hours of debate. Will the motion be very specific just to mask wearing, or will we also be able to raise issues like airflow and ultraviolet filtering of air, infection control and treatments, which are also very important in combating the virus?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend is, I think, promoting me to your role to decide what will be orderly to debate tomorrow. But the 3 hours will cover, as I said, wearing of face coverings and the health protection coronavirus restriction self-isolation. I think that I look with trepidation at the chair, in case I'm overruled, that will allow for quite a wide debate, and I would be surprised if it were interpreted too narrowly.
Indeed. Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The thing is that during COVID, we've started developing really bad habits. Yeah. As I understand it, the measure has not yet been laid. It's not available for any of us to see. It won't be available until later on today. It will start to apply tomorrow morning at 4, and we will then be legislating for it retrospectively tomorrow afternoon. This is not the right way to do legislation. Every single SI that I've been involved in committee corridors in recent months has been retrospective legislation after it has already come into force. This is not the way the House should progress, surely to God.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman's quite long question was, I hope, going to go on slightly longer, because I understand the regulations will be laid by 5 o'clock. So had he gone on for another 3 minutes, they would then have been laid. But I think the honourable gentleman, who's getting a little bit grumpy at the moment, is ignoring the fact that these matters are genuinely urgent. That, of course, it is right that laws should not come in retrospectively in the normal course of events, but our statutes provide for statutory instruments to be brought in and debated subsequently for a very good purpose. And the purpose is that sometimes things need to be done with dispatch. And the dither and delay of the opposition, who would have kept us in lockdown forever, is something that they should remember when asking questions about the speed with which we introduce things.
Bob Seeley.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just to follow up the point raised by honourable friend, the member for Forest of Dean, I have a lot of sympathy with what the Leader of the House is saying. We have acted quickly, so we're learning lessons from early in the pandemic, and he is respecting the House by bringing in a 3-hour debate, a very timely debate, as soon as reasonably possible. So actually, he gets brownie points on both those. My question is slightly, though, come 3 weeks, when we extend, or God help us, not worsen the situation, then we're not going to be able to discuss or do anything on it for at least another 2.5 weeks afterwards, and that is an issue.
Madam Speaker, I obviously understand that. Christmas comes but once a year, and when it comes, it brings a parliamentary recess as well as good cheer. And we have been recalled under certain circumstances. We were last year, but to do it over the Christmas recess is extraordinarily rare, and I think for very good reason. Now, obviously, we all hope that in 3 weeks this will expire. But I can't give any guarantees on that, nor can I give any guarantees on when the decisions will be made in relation to the renewal date. But I will always do my best to facilitate Parliament, but in a way that recognises actually how Parliament wants to be facilitated. I am not convinced that all 650 members want to be back here on the 24th or 25th of December.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tomorrow we will be debating restrictions which are designed to not just reduce transmission, but I presume also to protect the NHS. I was disappointed that on the 16th of November, a health minister responded to a parliamentary question of mine saying that they had no intention of publishing any assessment of the impact of the current COVID hospitalisations on the availability of NHS beds, staff and elective procedures. So in order for members of this House to have an informed debate tomorrow on the impact of restrictions and whether they are sufficient to protect the NHS this winter, could the Leader of the House please confirm if he will ask the Secretary of State for Health to publish a statement tomorrow morning about the impact of COVID hospitalisations on beds, staff and elective procedures?
Madam Deputy, I don't want to be unhelpful, but I think that was a question that might have been better asked to the statement by my right honourable friend, who would have been able to give a direct answer. But I would suggest the honourable lady raises it in the debate tomorrow.
Thank you. We now move on to the next item of business. I will delay for a moment to let people leave the chamber quietly and safely with the usual social distancing. Very well done, thank you. Presentation of Bill. Paul Maynard.
House of Lords Elected Senate Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 14th of January.
Friday, the 14th of January. I have the feeling that the Right Honourable Gentleman for New Forest East might be there on that day. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Bill, Lords, second reading. Now.
I call the Minister, Eddie Hughes, to move second.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Bill be now read a second time. As honourable members may know, I've long championed a root and branch comprehensive reform of our leasehold system. It's been a long journey to get here, from my private member's bill to try and overhaul the regulations on ground rents. So it is particularly gratifying to be stood here today as the Minister responsible for this hugely important piece of legislation. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the bill will make home ownership fairer and more transparent for future generations of leaseholders. We'll do this by reducing the ground rent on new residential long leases where a premium is paid to a peppercorn. I'm sure that this change, which is going to benefit thousands of future leaseholders, will be welcomed right across the House.
Will you allow me?
Of course I will give way.
I lobbied for an exemption for the retirement living industry, which was granted and then withdrawn in January this year. Why was that?
Well, I thank the right honourable member for his intervention, and I appreciate his strong lobbying on this matter. But I think the government decided that it was appropriate to treat all leaseholders the same, and therefore we made that change, although we did allow an extension in the introduction of that April 2023. Of course.
The bit I don't understand is why we have leasehold at all, frankly. I mean, it's just a preposterous nonsense, isn't it? A feudal relic. Wouldn't it just make far more sense to have some kind of common hold situation for flats, which is what they have in nearly every other country of the world, and I think I'm right in saying also in Scotland? Wouldn't that make far more sense than just get rid of leasehold completely?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I wonder why, in the brief periods where Labour have been in control, they haven't done so themselves. But I guess English law is pretty complex, and so it wouldn't be so straightforward to simply withdraw it on the basis the honourable gentleman suggests. But perhaps when Labour are in power again at some point in the distant future, they'll be able to return to this matter.
Being very generous. He may not wish to be as radical as what the member for Rhondda is suggesting, but would he share with me my concern at some of the more greedy developers who are insisting on this year-by-year annual increase? For example, in the New River Village in Hornsey, where the rents are just going up, and I have to name the Barclay Group because they really should know better. They've done very well, including through coronavirus and all the leg-ups that they've had from the government through various coronavirus packages. They really shouldn't be demanding multiples and multiples and multiples every year from my poor old leaseholders.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree largely with what the honourable lady said, not least because the 10-minute rule bill that I referred to, that I brought previously as a backbencher, completely endorsed the points that she was making. It is unfortunate that some people have included such egregious terms in their ground rents. Of course.
But given way. Would you agree with me? You know, it isn't only ground rents; it's the admin fees that are often associated with any minor changes that the owner of the property wants to do. And also, the other thing is, a lot of these properties are linked also with extra charges for management fees for the land and other things. And it is becoming totally unacceptable, the levels of charges that are placed on these leaseholders.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't want to jump forward several pages in my speech, but the honourable gentleman is predicting, or at least pointing to the fact that we have identified this as a problem and ensured that when we reduce ground rents to a peppercorn, people won't be able to cheat by introducing associated management fees and other things to try to introduce charges. And if he's looking for further changes, no doubt the second part of our seminal legislation, when it comes in due course, will satisfy his needs. Now, the starting point for all of this has to be our shared recognition that, for many people, to be a leaseholder is also to be a homeowner. We are clear that homes that have been bought should be theirs to live in and enjoy. They should not be treated as cash cows for third-party investors. This government is on the side of homeowners, and that is why we committed in our manifesto to introduce this important legislation. Honourable members will be well aware of the problems many leaseholders have faced in recent years, as pointed out by members on the other side, spiralling ground rents and onerous conditions that have turned the dream of home ownership into a nightmare for some leaseholders. This bill is the first of our seminal two-part legislation to reform and improve the leasehold system. Further legislation will follow later in this Parliament to continue to address the historic imbalances in the leasehold system. Of course, give way.
Thank the Minister very much indeed, and I pay tribute to him for the work that he's done so far. He may know that constituents in Warrington South on Steinbeck Grange have been calling for changes for almost 10 years. I wonder if you could give an update on the Competition and Markets Authority's investigation that's taking place at the moment, because that's something that really is vitally important to people living in Warrington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank the honourable gentleman. The work of the CMA, I think, has been pivotal so far in already changing the behaviour of a number of significant developers. I've spoken to the CMA recently. Further work is ongoing, and I'm hoping they will have further successes in the future. He's completely right to raise this point. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, both this bill and the wider leasehold reform programme have been informed by consultation. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those present here today, including members of the opposition front bench, who have taken the time to discuss this issue, and I look forward to further discussions over the coming weeks and months. Now, this bill has a very specific, I can't even say it, Madam Deputy Speaker, specific focus: the ground rent in future long residential leases. We know that some existing leaseholders face substantial difficulties, including costly enfranchisement, a lack of transparency and burdensome lease terms. We know that escalating ground rents in particular can reach unaffordable levels and make some properties difficult to sell. That is not right, and that is why we've asked the Competition and Markets Authority to conduct a thorough investigation into potential mis-selling and unfair terms in the leaseholder sector. Will of course give way again.
Thank you for giving way. Would you also accept that, and I have met many people that were told by the company that sold them the property that they would be able to buy the lease, only for when they inquire to buy it, find out that actually it's been sold on to some financial institution?
Shame.
Madam Deputy Speaker, once again the honourable gentleman points out egregious and unfortunate practice which hopefully we will be finding ways to address in the future.
With respect.
If the honourable gentleman would just forgive me if I give way behind me first.
That begs the question of what proposals he may have to enable leaseholders to enforce the purchase of freeholds from such companies. Does he have plans for that?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the right honourable gentleman will know. Unfortunately, I'm not the Secretary of State, much as I'd like to be, and it's best to leave the formation. It's best to leave not yet. It's best to leave the fine detail of the formation of future legislation to the Secretary of State to decide. But, however, I look forward to discussing the matter further with my right honourable friend as we progress. Sorry, can I give way at the back first because I said I would?
I was grateful to the Minister for giving way, and he's been very generous with his time, but I listened to my right honourable friend from Alan Deeside and others. Now, the Minister is waiting for this Competition and Markets Authority report, but is he prepared to say, even before that report has concluded, that on the basis of all the evidence we're hearing from right across the House, that what we're seeing here is nothing more than a financial scam from a bunch of greedy speculators?
Yeah! Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not sure I can go that far as to agree, but what I can say is a number of honourable members on both sides of the chamber have pointed out unfortunate practice which we will be seeking to address in future legislation.
Thank him for giving way, and he is being very generous with his time. He remembers well what it's like to be on the backbenches. And would he agree with me that many of the points under discussion will be good for future generations, but it's all a bit jammed tomorrow if we can't help our constituents today?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say we're doing a very important thing with today's legislation, which is effectively drawing a line in the sand to prevent future onerous ground rent clauses, and I think then we'll have the opportunity, once we've drawn that line, to then work, hopefully quickly, to deal with things from existing ground rent problems. I'll give way one more time, and then I think I should read some of my speech.
I'm very grateful. I have been known to swim against the tide once or twice. In this particular debate, I draw my House's attention to my registered members' interests. I'm a leaseholder, not a freeholder in this context, but nevertheless, to think effectively scrapping leasehold is a panacea and moving to commonhold is a panacea is not right. And for evidence of that, honourable members should look at this system in Scotland, which moved to this kind of commonhold system. 80% of buildings are requiring maintenance, a £2 billion maintenance backlog, unfunded backlog. We should step forward very carefully. Leasehold does need reform, but I'm very concerned if we effectively scrap it altogether, we'll create ourselves a new problem.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and he is incredibly knowledgeable in this area. I remember discussing my 10-minute rule bill with him at the time, and I can completely assure him that we will proceed with caution and seek advice from experts both across the House and from outside of the House, and I look forward to discussing with him again in the future. Now, I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank, and I'm delighted to see him in his place, the former Secretary of State, the Honourable Member for Newark, for all the work that he put in driving forward this agenda. Back in January, he announced measures to make buying the freehold or extending a lease cheaper and easier for many leaseholders. So, turning now to the specifics of the bill before us today. Ground rent is usually paid annually by leaseholders to their freeholder or landlord, but crucially, no tangible service is provided in return. The industry is also familiar with the term peppercorn rent to describe a token or nominal rent used as a payment in forming a contract, which typically is not actually collected in practice. Historically, ground rents were generally very low, but the last 2 decades have seen a surge in properties sold with significant and escalating ground rents. At its worst, this practice can lead to properties becoming unsellable. These unfair practices have caused real misery for those affected and in turn have undermined the reputation of the leasehold system. Regardless of whether the ground rent is a nominal peppercorn or thousands of pounds, the fundamental issue is that no meaningful service is provided in return. We want to end this for new leases, and that is why we're legislating so that new residential long leases will have no financial demand for ground rent. Instead, nothing more than an actual peppercorn can be collected from the leaseholder. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will of course give way.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for giving way. Will he acknowledge that the situation is slightly different in relation to retirement housing, where ground rents have been, it's been the practice to use them to more or less fund the shared spaces, and that ground rents have been part of making retirement housing viable, and will he take care to ensure that this bill doesn't have unintended consequences for retirement housing?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I say the reason that we've extended the introduction of this legislation with regard to those properties is to allow time for people to adjust their business models accordingly to ensure that they can cope with the change in legislation. Now, regardless of whether the ground rent is a nominal peppercorn, my apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker, to avert the risk of possible future shortages of peppercorns and to ensure that our meals continue to be well seasoned, I should clarify that we do not expect any landlord to actually require the payment of a physical peppercorn each year. So in reality, the new genuine peppercorn rent for future leaseholders means that they will not pay the rent. I will now turn to the specifics of the legislation. The provisions of this bill apply to residential long leases in England and Wales over 21 years, for which a premium is paid. The inclusion of the requirement for a premium clarifies that normal and legitimate practices relating to rat rents can continue. For leases regulated under the bill, the rent demanded will not be any more than literally 1 peppercorn per year. Now, turning to the definition of rent. Following much careful deliberation, we have arrived at a broad and flexible definition of rent, using the real-world meaning and therefore including anything in the conventional nature of rent. The government is clear that landlords should retain the ability to collect legitimate charges. The definition will make sure landlords can still collect legitimate charges where the market reserves them as rent, such as charges for services like building maintenance. The broad definition will deter freeholders or landlords from trying to circumvent the new system by disguising ground rent as a different charge. It will also enable appropriate tribunals to make sound judgments on whether a leaseholder has in fact been charged a prohibited rent. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we plan to leave no loopholes for unscrupulous individuals. So we're also banning the charging of an admin fee for collecting peppercorn rent. Where a prohibited rent or administrative charge is paid, leaseholders will have the right to apply to the first tier tribunal in England or the leasehold valuation tribunal in Wales. Provided that the tribunal deems the payment inappropriate, the relevant authority can then order the amount to be repaid, and in the case of prohibited rent, this must be within 28 days, potentially also with interest. There are a limited number of exceptions from the provision of the bill. The first of these are leases used purely for a business purpose. The intention behind the bill has never been to reduce business leases to a peppercorn rent. So, through careful consideration, we've accepted business leases that include the use of a dwelling in any way that protects the interest of both residential leaseholders and commercial landlords. For mixed-use properties, such as a flat above a shop, the exception will only apply if the residential use significantly contributes to the business purpose of the lease. Community-led housing may have few other feasible funding schemes to continue to grow developments that benefit the community rather than to secure profits. To maintain this growth, we have exempted community-led housing schemes. Home finance plan leases are also accepted. These include regulated home reversion plans such as equity release and rent-to-buy agreements where the consumer purchases the freehold at the end of the term. We will also allow shared ownership landlords to continue to collect a market rent on their share of the property. This practice is integral to the shared ownership model. Of course, give way.
It's setting out a list of exemptions. Is on that list one that included complex developments? Can I set out, it might be a tube station, for example, with a cinema attached or a shopping centre attached with a block of flats above it, all part of the same effectively development. Who is going to manage the complexity of that development? Would he set out how that's going to happen? I've got to say, if I was one of the residents, a long leaseholder in that block of flats, I wouldn't be very keen to manage all the M&E stuff within that development.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not sure I completely understand the point the Honourable Gentleman is making, because actually this won't change the management of the operation of that building. It will just prevent ground rent being charged, and if the leaseholder feels that they are being charged inappropriately, then they'll have the right to appeal for that to be determined by the Ways and Means Authority.
Sorry, I should clarify. He's quite right. You could get a management company to look after the whole entity. But there are things that affect all areas, common areas, for example, insurance over the whole building, many other issues like that that require somebody to have an overarching view of the entire development. I'm not sure how that's provided for. In fact, the Select Committee looked into this in 2019 when I was a member and said there should be exemption for complex developments on that basis, but that doesn't appear in the legislation, despite the fact that was referred to in the Lord's debates.
Well, as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, our intention is to ensure that this applies in as many circumstances as possible in terms of fairness. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll be very happy to pick up with the Honourable Gentleman for further discussion subsequent to this debate today, which I hope he is contributing to. Anyway, back to the speech, Madam Deputy Speaker. Statutory lease extensions are the subject of existing legislation and so are not covered by this bill. The peppercorn limit will apply to the extended portion of any lease extended through the voluntary process. I should finally note, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there is no longer an exception for the retirement sector. As I said earlier to the Right Honourable Lady, we believe that all new leaseholders should benefit from these reforms. The measures for the retirement properties will not apply earlier than the 1st of April 2023. Some honourable members, some in the Chamber, have raised this as a concern in correspondence, and it has been debated at some length in the other place. We feel that the transition period strikes the right balance between the sector and consumers. Madam Deputy Speaker, we recognise that these provisions require a robust and effective enforcement regime. Freeholders and landlords who abuse the system and deliberately seek to charge a non-peppercorn ground rent on leases in contravention of this bill will be subject to steep fines up to £30,000. After listening and considering carefully the view expressed in the other place, we came to the conclusion that the level of fines should be higher. The new maximum fine of £30,000 brings this bill in line with other housing penalties, including the Tenant Fees Act. The bill will ensure that fines can be even steeper for the more egregious abuses of the system. For example, if a freeholder breaks the law with unfair rents at multiple locations, like in a block of flats, they will pay a penalty per lease. And it doesn't stop there. Penalties can be supplemented by the repayment of all prohibited rent collected. Enforcement will be the responsibility of the Local Trading Standards Authority, who already do an excellent job enforcing similar housing regulations. District councils in England will also have the power to take enforcement action if they choose. We recognise that enforcement will require additional resourcing, and that is why authorities will be able to retain the proceeds of any penalties that they impose to use towards meeting the costs incurred in enforcement of residential leasehold property. Taken together, I believe that the enforcement regime will act as an effective deterrent whilst giving authorities the flexibility they need to make sure that any enforcement action taken is proportionate. Madam Deputy Speaker, our vision for a reformed and improved leasehold system is one that is anchored in fairness and transparency. For too long, too many leaseholders have been let down by institutional inertia and a ground rent system that has not worked in their interests. It is a system that has been dogged by opaque rules and has left many people in the dark. This legislation is targeted exactly where it needs to be, and by reducing future ground rents to a peppercorn, we are going to deliver a tangible and meaningful improvement to home ownership for future generations. So, we've engaged extensively to get to this point, and this process is by no means over. We are clear-eyed on the challenges ahead and know there is more to do. But today is a significant step towards fixing our broken leasehold system for good, and I commend this to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read the second time. Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Leasehold Ground Rents Bill sets ground rents on new leasehold homes to peppercorn levels. And this small, very, very small step towards reform is one that we welcome, and we won't be opposing this bill this evening. Generating incomes through high ground rents is an outrageous practice, as has been discussed. However, serious leasehold reform is now long overdue. It's largely been the main way that properties in shared blocks or converted flats are owned in this country, stemming from arcane feudal laws which date back to the landed gentry and aristocracy, and it needs reform urgently. But in its more recent manifestation, in what can only be described as a scam on an industrial scale, as has already been pointed to this evening, against innocent leaseholders, increasingly in new houses, not just flats, it's totally wrong and it needs ending. I absolutely will give way on this.
Giving way. And, you know, I have been struck when you look at two houses, absolutely the same, one next door to one another. One is leasehold and the other is freehold. And we see it all the time. And now when you see a house advertised, quite often it'll say, this is not leasehold. You know, pointing out that fact. And these properties are being devalued by the day.
Well, my good friend makes an extremely well-made point, and the practice of new homes being built as leasehold, sold as leasehold, and people often didn't even know that was the case originally, has got out of all kilter lately, especially in North Wales and in the northwest of England, where it's been a particularly egregious practice. So while I welcome this bill, albeit a bit too little too late, it does nothing to trap those in these injustice of leasehold. It does nothing to protect them. Nor does it do anything for those facing overbearing ground rent increases today or yesterday, nor does it put an end to some of the most egregious practices, like selling new houses as leasehold. The ground rent scandal typifies everything that's gone wrong with our housing market in this country. Housing has become a commodity to be traded, packed up as financial products, thrown into an unregulated market. Large-scale developers and investors have been given a free rein to create ever more complex financial products to squeeze money out of homeowners. Many people don't even realise when they buy their house that they won't actually own the land underneath it, as my friend has just made clear. Even worse, the leases often contain clauses to double ground rents, in some cases every 10 years, meaning a homeowner in a property worth a modest £200,000 might see themselves paying £10,000 a year in ground rents after they've owned the property for 50 years or so. Yes, I will, absolutely.
Would you share my concern that this has got so out of hand that the amounts being charged are even in excess of RPI, which you would expect to be at least a basic marker, and that people are feeling really trapped now that they can't sell on?
She makes a really good point. People are trapped in this situation because we all know when we're looking to buy a home, we look at the overheads, we look at what those ongoing service charges, ground rents and other costs might be, and they're now added in over recent years, rightly so. They're added into the affordability criteria. So it often means that people then can't actually get a mortgage for these homes. So it leaves the people living in them trapped in that situation with an unsellable home. Sorry? Of course I will.
Does this not beg an extraordinary question about the legal advice that was provided by the solicitors of those purchases when they entered into them?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad he raises that point because I'm sure colleagues around the House will be keen to highlight. Yeah, well, I'll try and answer it, and then when I don't answer it very well, I'll give way to my friend to answer it better for me. But what I do know is that, unfortunately, for many people who've bought houses in this situation, they were advised to use the solicitor of the marketing company, of the company selling those houses. I've got many in my own constituency, and so they were given poor advice. It is a mis-selling scam as well. Would he like to answer that better for me?
In many ways made the point that I was going to make, but they were, and quite often these were first-time buyers. They were really keen to get onto the housing market, to get their first home. And they were told, oh, don't use this solicitor or that solicitor. Use these, and we will give you a discount to use them. And shock horror, many of these people, as my honourable friend has made clear, weren't even aware that the property was leasehold, let alone all the other charges that are associated with that as well.
Yeah. Absolutely, he makes a very good point as well, and you know this is I think a lot of people. I will in just a moment. A lot of people in the country, especially first-time buyers, they don't understand the difference between leasehold, freehold, and so on. It's only as these problems arise later on, or they're trying to sell the property, that many of these issues come to light. I will give way.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. On the point of legal advice, I think it's worth pointing out that some people were told that they had to use particular solicitors in breach of Law Society guidelines. They're also told that they had to complete within a certain period of time. So even if they had used a different solicitor, it just wasn't practical for them to have analysed and understood the documents correctly. It points to me, in my mind, for there to be a complete overhaul and inquiry into how this scandal was allowed to develop in the first place.
Well, he makes an excellent point, and I do think there is a very strong basis for a wider mis-selling inquiry, a mis-selling scandal. It's affected many properties. I think we've seen over the last 10 years, in terms of houses, which is a particularly egregious practice, over 500,000 homes that have been built over the last 10 years, the vast majority of which are actually in the northwest of England and in North Wales, which is why so many colleagues from that part of the country are here, those countries are here this evening. So, as I was saying, the right to collect these ground rents is then bought and sold on the financial markets as steady income streams to investors, while leaseholders get nothing back for the thousands of pounds a year they are paying in some cases. And there's hardly a clearer illustration, I don't think, of the damaging, pervasive tendency to treat housing as an investment opportunity, as a product to trade on the market, rather than the homes that people live in and build their lives around. That should be the basis of housing in this country. And we've lost somewhere what housing is. It's homes, places where we live, where lives are built, where we become successful or not, where we bring up a family. That housing is not a commodity to be traded on the financial market. And we've seen, haven't we, more starkly than ever over the last 2 years, that housing is a public health issue. It's an educational issue. It's a work, security and happiness issue. And so we should begin to see it as such. So while we welcome this bill, it's a very narrow first step bill, and there was lots of glaring omissions that I think could have been brought into even a narrow bill such as this. So firstly, there's nothing to prevent freeholders simply transferring their income stream from ground rents to service charges or administration charges or other charges, as have already been highlighted. Not service charges or egregious administration charges, no there aren't. And as shown by the ground rent scandal itself, there's no limit to the ingenuity that some freeholders will draw on to capitalise off the back of leaseholders. Service charges and administration charges are opaque at best and far too hard to challenge. So will the Minister address this issue later on? Yes, I will, because he's a really good expert on this issue, so I'll gladly give way on it.
A few examples that I have come across are just people who own a house, they own the land around it in theory, leasehold, being asked to pay if they want a pet, being asked if they want to change the flooring in that house, change the layout of the garden. And I've had people say to me, I'm paying a mortgage on a house I don't really feel I own.
He's absolutely right. He's given a good, some good examples there, actually, some of which I was going to use later in my speech. But you know, he makes a very, very good point, and some of these charges are outrageous. So will the Minister, I think, will the Ministers respond to that in their summing up later about how we can stop that practice? Secondly, the millions of people already trapped in leasehold homes will see no benefit whatsoever from this bill. So all of the examples that we've already heard from will not end as a result of this bill. The government has chosen to limit the scope of the ground rents bill to new homes, meaning those already facing these bills will see no benefit at all. So delay has real costs for them. Over 2 million homeowners have been trapped in this feudal leasehold system since his government came to power. So he can pass the book on to us for 11 years ago, but over 2 million new homeowners have been trapped in this system since his government came to power. The Competition and Markets Authority has done some good work taking down the largest and worst offending of the freeholders, but we can't wait for them to take on every single company involved in this outrageous practice. So will the Minister, when it comes to committee stage, will he work with us and support our proposal, which we'll be tabling at committee stage, to protect existing leaseholders? Third, this bill does nothing to stop new houses being sold as leasehold at all. Leasehold houses are straightforwardly wrong for the reasons that we have heard already. So at the same time that the government promised to set ground rents as peppercorn, which this bill does, they also committed to end the practice of newly built homes being sold as leasehold. 500,000 houses have been sold as leaseholds in 2010, 60% of them in the North West. These homeowners face not just exorbitant ground rents, but also restrictions on how they can alter their homes. And as we've already heard some of those examples, that if you want to have a pet, you have to ask permission. If you want to make changes to the building, you have to ask for permission. And all too often people are left feeling they don't really own the home at all. And when the leaseholder try to escape this nightmare by buying out the freehold, they often discover all kinds of other restrictions they weren't told about when they bought their home.
So this needs to change. And as recently as 2017, the government promised legislation to prohibit new residential long leases from being granted on houses. So when will this come in, and why is that not included in this bill? It makes no sense to me whatsoever that this hasn't made it into this bill. So perhaps, again, ministers will work with us in committee stage, some of my colleagues in here today at committee stage, to end new leasehold on houses altogether. So there was a lot more the government could have done in a simple first step bill, but hopefully, as we've heard this evening, the whole House will recognise that wholesale reform of leasehold is long overdue. The building safety crisis has brought into stark relief how terrible our feudal leasehold laws are. Innocent leaseholders can be passed remediation bills totalling hundreds of thousands of pounds with no right of recourse. It's a David and Goliath situation that's hitting more and more homeowners across the country. Fixing the building safety crisis truly must mean fixing our outdated leasehold laws as well. As the last few years have shown, this is now an urgent task. So we call on the government to do some simple things when it comes to wider leasehold reform. Enable leaseholders to extend the lease or buy the freehold. Make common hold the norm and make it much easier for properties to operate that way. Abolish marriage value, as they promised they would. Strengthen leaseholders' voice and simplify the right to manage. And give real teeth and real recourse to the bodies which are supposed to arbitrate and act on behalf of leaseholders or create new ones altogether. And prevent freeholders from passing on extortionate costs for remediation works in law and for putting right problems that they have created that are not the problems of the leaseholders, as well as the things that I've already discussed. These are just some of the reforms that are urgently needed to ensure that no leaseholder is trapped against their will in this broken, outdated system. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is a tentative attempt at reform, and while it's welcome, it represents a massive missed opportunity to transform a leaseholder sector that continues to scam working people on an industrial scale. Even in a slimmed-down bill, the government has failed to close loopholes, protect those already in leasehold homes, or end the sale of new houses as leasehold altogether. Wholesale reform is urgently needed to ensure that nobody continues to be voiceless, trapped in leasehold homes they cannot sell, and facing ever-growing bills and charges. Thank you.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, it will come as no surprise to right honourable and honourable members to hear that I strongly support this bill. It would be surprising if I didn't, as I was one of the ministers who instigated it, although stranger things have happened in politics. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Minister for his hard work in bringing this bill to the House, the noble Lord Greenhouse, who's worked extremely hard on this issue for many months, and the fantastic civil servants at the department who have taken this forward. And there is a very strong, albeit very small, team of civil servants who have been beavering away on this issue for many months, and will have a lot of work to do ahead of them, not just in taking this bill forward, but perhaps more importantly, in preparing the next bill, which I'll come on to speaking about in a moment. I think this is an important step on the road to leasehold reform. It's a road which really began in 1967 with the Leasehold Reform Act, which gave tenants of houses the right to buy their freehold. It then took the next step forward in 1993 with the Leasehold Reform Act that gave leasehold tenants of flats the right collectively to buy their freehold. There was a great deal of opposition back in the major government to that reform, both in this House, in the House of Lords, and from propertied interests who said that that would be a disaster for the housing market. It wasn't, and those rights have been enjoyed by hundreds of thousands of people pursuing the dream of home ownership across the country. And then the last Labour government took it forward one further step with the Common Hold and Leasehold Reform Act in 2002 that introduced common hold, albeit not nearly as successfully as they would have hoped and I would like to see taken forward in the years ahead. The destination, to me, of these reforms is not just a better situation for leaseholders, but is actually the gradual elimination of leasehold altogether. It is, as some have said here today, essentially a feudal form of tenure, a product of our rich and ancient history as a country, but one which is no longer fit for purpose. It doesn't exist in any other developed country in the world, and it doesn't, in essence, have a place in a modern society. The bill before us today is, as my predecessor as Housing Secretary, the Noble Lord Young, said in the House of Lords, an appetizer for the main course. That is a comprehensive piece of legislation to remove more of the iniquities of the present leasehold system and to pave the way for the wholesale introduction of commonhold. I will.
I'm very encouraged to hear that he is so forward-looking on this matter. Could I ask him, therefore, if he could explain to the House how one rather backward step took place some months ago, which was the allowing of it to become routine that additional stories could be added to existing blocks of flats. I have lived through that experience and found not only that it is terrible to have a floor inserted above you, but that when things go horribly wrong with the construction and the company goes bust or winds itself up, it's the leaseholders who have to pay thousands upon thousands of pounds to put right the faults. So would he not like to revisit that change that was made and perhaps suggest that it ought to be looked at again?
Well, it wouldn't be for me to revisit that if we wanted to, but the purpose of that piece of legislation, which was supported by many members in this House, was to deliver more homes, particularly in brownfield sites and in urban areas, as part of all of our mission to deliver more homes and to tackle the housing crisis, and particularly to enable individual homeowners to build upwards on their home as their own household expands, particularly if they're having young children or elderly relatives moving into the home. And so I think it's an important step forward. But of course, as with any of these changes, we should keep it under review. And if there are common instances of abuse or malpractice, then we should see if there are ways of eliminating that. I will make progress if my honourable friend doesn't mind. So the bill really today before us was born out of two issues. One was a much more recent phenomenon, which was, as has been detailed already by the front benches and interventions to them, the abuse of leasehold in recent years. A system which was never perfect, and many of us would wish to see reformed, was subject to wholesale abuse and rip-off practices by developers and freeholders, using ground rents as an income stream and escalating those, leaving leaseholders in a perilous position. And the use of leasehold for properties for no good reason whatsoever, purely to benefit from the ground rents. And we've heard examples of that already, in particular, the use of ground rents for houses, where it's difficult to consider any house needs to be built as a leasehold property. In different times in the past, I've bought the argument, or bought into the argument, I'll come to the honourable gentleman in a moment, that there might be exceptional reasons why one would need to build a home, but it is very difficult to think of what those exceptional reasons would be. It's not used in other countries around the world, including countries like the United States, where there are gated communities, communities for the elderly, all manner of different homes. They're not being built as leasehold properties, so I don't see why they should be in this country. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I agree fully with that point. And as he has said, this was a practice that had largely gone out. You know, they were not, properties for years were not built, houses were not built as leasehold. But in the North West, as has been said, and in North Wales, a group of builders decided this was going to be an extra way of scamming, and I use the word scamming, even more money off of the people buying the properties.
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. I don't disagree in any way. The North West was particularly targeted for reasons I don't understand, but you saw tens of thousands of homes built in this manner. And it really is disgraceful, and it gave leasehold a very bad name and necessitated the changes that we're making today and the ones that will come forward in the future. The bill ends those practices for new properties. That's the key thing. It will ensure that the business model behind ground rent, the need to create those properties as leasehold in order to benefit commercially, will come to an end. And we're already seeing its gradual reduction. This will lead to its elimination. I wanted to answer one point which has already been raised in the debate, which was why extend this to retirement properties. I came under, as Secretary of State, fierce resistance and lobbying from the retirement property sector, whose lobbyists approached members of Parliament, approached my department, and threatened judicial review against our proceedings. I considered it to be an unfair practice targeted at the most elderly and vulnerable in our society, that in addition to paying their service charge, they should also be paying a ground rent, and one which might be escalating at a significant pace. Why not have a more fair and transparent system where an elderly person knows exactly what they're getting when they pay the purchase price on their property and when they then pay the service charge on an annual basis, instead of receiving 2 bills every year? I think that's a simple matter of fairness and transparency, and it was the right decision to bring that to an end. We did, however, give a longer period for those businesses to transition and to change their business model, which is why that part of industry doesn't feel the force of this bill until 2023. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the... thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I appreciate the work that he's done on trying to get the right balance and stand up for the interests of homeowners rather than large corporations. Further to the point made by the honourable gentleman for the New Forest, I do wonder perhaps if he has any reflections on the some of the knock-on effects of the allowing the additional stories to be built on existing blocks of flats. In my experience, there's an element of exploitation here, and as indeed the honourable gentleman mentioned, both of people living in flats which have, I think the word is top-hatted developments, but also the neighbours, and certainly in the area that I represent, there have been a number of problems for neighbours of these blocks. And I wonder if he had any further reflections on that, and perhaps whether, if he was still the Secretary of State, whether he would have allowed that to go ahead.
Well, I think it should be kept under review, as with any permitted development. We've seen with the ones that were brought in the past, there's always cases at the edges which concern us, and there are usually ways in which you can refine the permitted development over time to ensure that they don't happen again. I think from memory with that permitted development, we did ensure that the developer has to work with the local council to ensure that there aren't issues in terms of building safety, loss of amenity to the leaseholders in the building, and that the design of the extra stories is broadly in keeping with the neighbourhood. But I certainly think this is something that should be kept under review. Well, I will give way if that's what the right honourable gentleman wants, but I appreciate there are many others who want to speak in this debate.
As I do. But it would be quite unlawful for the capital cost of the communal areas in a retirement living to be paid for through an administration charge. So it comes back to the question of whether it is in the interest of the purchaser to pay a ground rent or to make the upfront cost in the purchase price. And for a category of elderly people, it may well be in their interests to pay it as a ground rent rather than upfront cost.
Well, my right friend gets to the nub of the issue. The debate was exactly as he says, whether it would be better for a retired person looking into moving into one of those communities to pay a somewhat lower purchase price for their property or the share in the property that they were taking, and then for as long as they live there, to be paying a ground rent, which might be escalating at an unfair level, and the service charge. Now, that's not a system that occurs in any other country in the world, including, as I say, countries like the United States that are far more advanced in their take-up of retirement properties than we are. I took the view that it would be much fairer and more transparent for an individual to know exactly what they're having to pay from the outset. They pay their purchase price, and then they pay their service charge. they don't have to face this escalating ground rent. And I think that makes sense to me. I appreciate that there will be differences of opinion on that, but it was done as a matter of basic fairness. Now, I want to make a couple of other points, if I may, before allowing others to speak. The first was to make clear that although this is a very limited bill in scope, the reason for that was to bring an end to these unfair practices as quickly as possible. That was the advice of the Law Commission, who said it was better to do this as a two-step process so that the iniquity of the escalating ground rents was brought to a close, and then one could move on to a much more complex piece of legislation that will inevitably take both the Department and Parliament a great deal of time to prepare and to pass. And so I think that probably was the best way to proceed. The second point is to say that as a postscript to the events of the last few years, two things I think do emerge. Firstly was the point that's already been made by my right honourable friend, that we do need to think about the conveyancing solicitors who gave advice or failed to do so in the process of these house sales. They did fail in their duties to their clients. I've had many constituents come to my surgeries who were oblivious to the homes that they were buying, not just in this situation, but also those homes that are subject to management fees as well, which may be very high and involve some of the charges that we've heard about that the honourable gentleman mentioned, for example, to put up a satellite dish or to build a conservatory and so on. I think conveyancing solicitors need to take much greater care in bringing these matters to the attention of their clients. And then secondly, the work of the Competition and Markets Authority must move forwards now at pace. They've already ensured that some of the major developers settle, but I certainly would encourage all the developers who are behind the sale of these properties, many of whom who have missold these properties to members of the public, to now do the decent thing, do the inevitable thing, and settle so that those purchasers get some compensation for the issues that they've faced. I see that many are on the cusp of doing that, but I hope that the remaining ones will do so quickly. Now, just to turn, if I may, briefly to the next bill to come along, I hope that the government will ensure that this comes in the next Queen speech and that is delivered early in that session. There is, as I say, a great deal of work for the department to do to prepare that bill and to ensure that it is sufficiently comprehensive. But I think it's extremely important that it does, and that within the course of this Parliament we make that comprehensive reform to leasehold. And that should include legislating for 990-year leases, a simpler, cheaper enfranchisement process, the end of marriage value, improving the position of leaseholders in the management of buildings, and ending, as we've said, new houses being built and sold as leasehold, because there's really no justification for that. Lastly, I hope that that bill also talks to the destination of a world beyond leasehold. That must be the end point that we should be working towards. I established the Commonhold Council to see how we can chart that course. And it seems to me that all of the complex issues that are raised are surmountable. That is the evidence so far from the Commonhold Council. It also seems to me that Commonhold will never take shape in this country to any substantial degree unless there's a major government intervention, which means indicating that it is our tenure of preference, or it means setting an end date for new leasehold properties. And I certainly would favour the latter, that we say clearly that beyond a certain date, no property, whether it be a flat or a home, a house, should be built in this country unless it is commonhold. And I hope that the bill that comes forward in the next session will essentially set that course. I think that would be an important way forward to end a feudal system, to tackle some of these issues, and to help us to move forward as a country.
Justin Matters.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all state for the record that alongside the Right Honourable Member for Worthing West and the Honourable Member for St Albans, I'm a co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Leasehold and Commonhold Reform, where we are assisted by the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, who have been campaigning for many years for the kind of reform that we are debating today in this bill. So one might therefore think that this bill will be a cause for celebration, and indeed anything that puts another nail in the coffin of leasehold is to be welcomed. but one is left with a feeling that is a rather modest measure. Having taken 4 years to get here does mean that we are making what I consider to be glacial progress. Maybe compared to 1,000 years of leasehold, 4 years is actually pretty quick, but for those still trapped in unsellable or seriously devalued homes because of the leases they've signed, progress isn't coming quick enough. So I'm not a fan of market-based solutions generally. The market is indeed responsible for most of the egregious injustices that we've seen in leasehold, but to a significant extent the market has already moved away from imposing ground rents for most houses. Not because those who concocted the leasehold scandal have had a prick of conscience, but because a spotlight has been shone on the devastating consequences of their sharp practice. And in that respect, I pay tribute to the fantastic work of the National Leasehold Campaign, who have done more than just about anyone to bring to the public's attention the unfairness of leasehold. Of course, it is an irony that those campaigners do not stand to benefit from this legislation because, as has been pointed out already, this bill does nothing to tackle the existing problems. That said, their influence has already benefited mine and many other constituents. A new Redrow estate not far from where I live was originally selling properties on a leasehold basis. After some pretty determined campaigning from the National Leasehold Campaign, they decided to stop the sale of homes in the second phase as leasehold, unfortunately not before several hundred people had already bought their homes as leasehold. To be fair to Redrow though, they did then offer them the opportunity to purchase the freeholds after 2 years, although it was then a little unfortunate to say the least when they subsequently lowered the purchase price for the freehold again, creating another unfairness. So while I give them credit for stepping back and weaning themselves off the leasehold drug, it shouldn't obscure the fact that all of this could have been avoided if they'd not sold the properties as leasehold in the first place. And that takes me back to the basic concern that remains with this bill. It enshrines in law a two-tier system of home ownership when really we should be ending it altogether. There are actually now very few new houses being sold as leasehold, but there are still around 1.5 million houses that will remain leasehold after this bill becomes law. Is there a risk that by choking off future income streams, from those who see other people's homes as an investment will actually now turn their attention and redouble their efforts to squeeze as much as they can out of the existing properties? That's something I'll return to later, and a number of members have already talked about that. But turning to the big details of the bill itself, I know there's been an awful lot of consideration given to how you can actually define a ground rent, and that debate in itself is instructive, because how can a payment be made in return for which nothing is received be considered a proper legal payment? The short answer is it can't, and that is just another reason, I believe, to abolish leasehold altogether. The reality is that ground rent is a legal fiction, a method of maintaining control of securing an income for which you're required to do precisely nothing. So it's disappointing that lease extensions for houses are exempt from this bill, because there is significant concern that freeholders will put in massive multipliers when offering informal lease extensions just to make the premium look more attractive and lower, but they will then make their money back through allowing the ground rents to continue. And let's not forget in this, both parties do not have equal bargaining power. So this all just adds weight to the argument that what we've got here is a minor change that will help people in the future, when what we really need to do is deal with the injustices of the present. And the best way to deal with that, of course, is to abolish leasehold altogether. Yeah. And as I referred to a bit earlier on, what we also need to keep an eye on is whether those that have been involved in the systematic deception and mis-selling change their sites to deal with the new environment that this bill represents. Because they haven't gone away. Those offshore accounts, those trust funds, those private equity investors who see people's homes as an opportunity to cream in the cash long after the people living in them think they've bought them. I think in particular estate management companies have to have a close eye kept on them, in particular because that is one area where charges can easily be inflated to more than cover the loss of a ground rent. I certainly will give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think my honourable friend is making. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think my honourable friend is making a very important speech, and he's hit on a number of central issues. In particular, his comments and his own legal experience of the problems of these markets and how they are dysfunctional, with, on the one hand, developers with enormous financial power and legal resources, and on the other hand, humble first-time buyers. Does he agree with me that there needs to be a rebalancing here with far greater protection for first-time buyers and for ordinary householders, a much greater attempt made by the government to hold these large developers to account?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He makes a very interesting point. There is clearly an imbalance. There is clearly a number of ways which we've already explored to some extent in this debate where the enthusiastic, shall we say, first-time buyers just want to get into their new homes. They put their trust in people who have been assigned to deliver the legal niceties, who've been assigned to put a value on the property, who've been assigned to do the conveyancing. They put the trust in those people, and sometimes that trust has been betrayed by the egregious injustices that we've talked about.
Well, my friend, give way. I mean, he has mentioned management fees, which I see as the next scandal coming down the road. I mean, people who bought their properties perhaps being charged £100 or £200 a year thought, well, that's okay. That is now £400, £500, £600, and quite often there are additional charges because fences aren't covered, certain parts of the ground are not covered. And people have said to me, I pay my council tax twice, and that's how people see it, and it's totally unfair.
That's right, Mark.
I thank my right honourable friend and neighbour for his intervention. He has actually beautifully led me into the next section of my speech where I talk about exactly that, because I will never accept that it is right that developers choose not to pay a sum to councils to adopt the communal areas, but instead save themselves money by passing on that cost to the homeowners, and then also using that to make even more money from those homeowners by charging them for the things that ought to be coming out of council tax. And as my honourable friend has said, I worry that this trend will be accelerated because the ground rent gravy train is coming to an end, and that we will hear more and more stories of homeowners having no choice but to pay inflated annual service charges. They're given a choice, they would prefer to pay out of their council tax. Certainly will.
I'm very, very grateful. He's making a very good point on what I think what's referred to as fleehold. But does he agree it's entirely within the gift of the local authority to require that development to be made to adoptable standard in terms of the roads and the drainage, for example, so that, and then it is adopted by the local authority, and then they don't have to pay twice for these kind of services?
I thank him for his intervention. I think that is a fair point in theory. In practice, I find that it doesn't happen. I've certainly got some estates in my constituency that were built a dozen years ago, and they still haven't been adopted because the developers haven't put them up to the required standard, and then we get this to and fro, and it never ends because actually the developers have left town and they've got absolutely no interest or incentive to actually bring those areas up to the adopted standard.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Certainly will.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm also grateful for the advice that he has given to me and my constituents on just this exact matter when he, as a next-door neighbouring MP with a particular expertise. There is one estate, he'll be aware of it in my constituency, which has been parcelled up and given to different developers and has been developed at different periods over time. Not only do we have a problem with the local authority, but he will recall that we have a problem with different developers playing themselves off against each other in order to not bring it up to the standard the honourable member suggested.
Yeah, I thank my honourable friend and neighbour for his intervention, and I think he's made a point very well. And actually what all this points to is the lack of capacity in local authorities to actually tackle these issues, because I don't want to make a party political point, but we've had a decade of austerity, and we are seeing the consequences of that in the way local authorities are able to actually police these things. So what I would like to see is a crackdown on unfair fees and contract terms by having an enforceable list of what will be considered reasonable charges, and we should require transparency on those charges and give leaseholders a right to challenge rip-off fees and poor performance. We should also try and ensure residents are given greater powers to take over the management of their homes if that is the way we are going. Because I don't want to be standing here, as my honourable friend mentioned, I don't want to be here in a few years' time talking about yet another PPI for the house building industry because the government have once again failed to act on the warning signs that are all there for us to see. So this bill must be promptly followed by the promised wider leasehold reforms, in particular the reforms we've been crying out for and that were actually promised, that will enable leaseholders to buy their freeholds quicker, easier and cheaper. And I've had a private member's bill ready to go for 3 years, which would have allowed us to do just that. Now, that could have already become law if there'd been a will to take on the freeholder interests that would have lost out as a result of that. But I guess I've got the message now that that piece of legislation isn't going to find favour with government. And of course, I'm aware that that wouldn't have meant an end to leasehold, but it would have at least have given the victims of this industrial scale con an opportunity to take back control of their properties at an affordable price. And I thought this government were all about taking back control, because do they not realise that if you're a leaseholder, you do not have control?
That's right, Justin.
What is stopping firmer action being taken against the freeholders? I know there are legal opinions about freeholders' human rights floating about, but what about my constituents' human rights? They have the right to live in their own home without someone else trying to make it a cash cow. Don't they have a right to expect the biggest purchase they ever make to be done fairly and to be properly regulated? Don't they have a right to have a government that is serious about stopping this industrial scale foul play that we've talked about tonight? So it is disappointing that whilst on the one hand the government accepts, and I quote, that unfair practices in the leasehold market can turn people's home ownership dreams into a nightmare, we are still waiting for action for the many leaseholders who have been trapped in this web, a web that they didn't sign up to. And we've been very clear that there are a number of reasons why they've found themselves in this position, not all of which I think have been resolved by the bill tonight. And we know that 1 in 3 leasehold houses that were sold in the Northwest in the past 10 years are leasehold, and those people will not benefit under this bill. Those are my constituents, my neighbours' constituents in my part of the world, and they've been disproportionately affected by the leasehold scandal, but they're still waiting for something that will actually help them. And I think if we're going to talk about levelling up in this place, we should be looking at things like that as well. It would deliver true justice and fairness and levelling up. So what we need when the Minister winds up is some clear timescales of when existing leaseholders can expect to see action on their concerns. What commitments can they expect? I think we all agree that what's happened here is unfair, it's a significant injustice, but when are we actually going to see action to put things right for existing leaseholders? The Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, when he was Community Secretary, promised an outright ban on leasehold for all houses 4 years ago. That's 4 years of people being trapped in homes they can't sell because of owners' ground rents. 4 years of stress and uncertainty about whether they should try and buy their freeholds now or wait until the law is reformed. And I get asked regularly, what should I do? Should I wait till the law changes? Well, it's very difficult to give an answer on that because we still have no clarity on when that law will be changed. So let's end 4 years of jam tomorrow. Let's deliver solutions for leaseholders today, and let's stand up to the vested interests and please finally abolish leasehold.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Madam Deputy Speaker.